Winnie the Pooh. It's 1940s, I think, something like that, 1944, I think. Interestingly, the mull has been economised on, and there's only mull top and bottom, nothing in the middle, and no tapes. So it's a fairly economical production. You have to be careful with this kind of thing that you're not actually taking the value away from a very old first edition or something like that. A first edition of Winnie the Pooh is probably worth about £2,000. This isn't. This is not a first edition, so it doesn't particularly matter. There are end papers which are sound. There's nothing wrong with that. There's a slight split there, but I don't think that matters. And the back, the end paper will need a bit of repair, but I think what I'll do is just put on it a bit of Japanese tissue, probably there, to hold it together. And then we can lift up this cloth here, take off the backing here with a lot of paste and just remove it so we can re-glue it, and put a new piece of cloth round, and then I'll replace the original spine on there. So that's fairly straightforward. And as I said in my introduction, here we've got a fairly solid end paper. It's got a slight crack there, but I don't think I'm going to worry too much about that. I could put a little bit of tissue on or repair tape if necessary. But basically the front of the book is sound, and one doesn't want to mess about more than you can help. So I don't think I really need to do much more than that. I've got to somehow get some new mull underneath the end paper. I've turned the camera around so that you can see a bit more easily what I'm doing, and I'll try to keep my right hand out of the way. Using a palette knife, which is blunt on the end, I'm just going to try to ease up where the mull is and ease it away from the board so that we'll be able to put a bit of new mull or aerolinen or whatever we're going to use. And in fact I'm going to take away a bit of the board with it. You can probably just see there that the board is beginning to come away from itself, so that the actual end paper is being supported by the board, and I'll work my way along there. A lot of this takes a long time, and you really mustn't hurry it. There's no point in rushing, because otherwise you'll just get a disaster. So in fact I'm effectively splitting the board slightly, and I'm just going to make sure that nothing's happening untoward there. Now you can see there's a bit of lift there, but that's fine, I've not gone through it. And if I do, it may be that in the course of this, yes, that is beginning to split. I may put a bit of Japanese tissue down there, but I'll see how we go. So I'm just going to ease my way along here. I'm not going to do the whole thing on camera because it's just too boring, but you can see there what I'm doing, just lifting it up so that I'll have some purchase for the new backing. I'm going to take off this little bit here of cloth, which is the original turn-in. It doesn't actually add very much. All it does is tell you the original colour, and in fact it's not faded very much really, which is good. And now I'm going to put the whole book into a press and put some paste over the whole thing to soften the glue, and then I'll be able to just lift it off without tearing the paper. So I've got my book here, and I'm going to put it in the finishing press, which I've got out here. It's only a little book, so it doesn't need to go in a lying press. It's rather pulled over. It's slightly out of shape, as books often are. Often the forage gets pulled over at the front. So I'm going to just push the book back a little bit, so we're going to be able to get it a little bit squarer when we actually replace the backing. And I'm going to put a protective bit of board either side. Don't ever put your book direct into a press without some sort of protective board on either side, because it may damage the cover. So I'm just going to tighten it enough to hold it, and it's not very, very tight, but that will hold it enough. And I'm going to put a thick layer of paste on. This is a powder paste, but you can use flour paste equally well. And I've actually made the paste in lockdown, and there's a decided shortage of flour, so I decided that it was probably best to use the powder paste at this stage and keep the flour for other things. So you can see it's a very thick layer. It's about 1/4 of an inch thick, and the idea is that it's a controlled damping of the glue on the back, and you don't want to get the back wet, wetter than you can help. And you don't want to leave this on too long. If you're not careful, you'll find, and it's a fairly dry paste, if you're not careful you'll find that the moisture goes down into the pages of the book and you may get staining on the inner pages, so you just need to be a bit careful. You don't leave it on too long. Don't leave it on overnight, for instance. I did do that once and had a dreadful problem with a stain that took a lot of getting out. So I'm just going to leave this on, but you can leave it on for a good hour or so. It takes that long to soften the glue adequately, but you can see I'm spreading it out and making it as smooth as I reasonably can. But it is a very thick layer, and paste dries very slowly, so that's the purpose of using paste. So I'm going to leave that for an hour, hour and a half perhaps, and then come back and take it off, and then we'll be able to remove the backing. So I'm now taking the paste off the spine again, and most of the glue has come away. There's a bit in the crevices, but mostly that's quite clear enough. So I'll just spend a bit of time picking these out. As I said, an awful lot of this sort of work is rather boring and repetitive, and it takes a long time, so you don't want to worry if you seem to be spending an awful lot of time doing it. You need to be patient, otherwise you'll find that you damage the paper, especially now as it's rather wet, so I'm going carefully. And you notice I'm using the palette knife rather than anything else. It's blunt, and so it doesn't cause any damage to the paper. So I'm just easing away what I can. Any bits of thread left over from the mull, if you can pull them off, do, otherwise it's not going to matter if they stay on. So I'm just going to try to ease out this last little bit of glue here. So that's pretty well cleaned up. I'll just tidy it up a bit more and then I'll be ready to put the new back on. So now I've cleared the back enough anyway here, and the sewing is quite sound, so I don't need to do anything to it. You'll see also that the shape is improved. It was like that, but I can now push it back into a rather more conventional shape. I've looked at the end paper. That's come away, the front end paper, but it is slightly damaged, so I think what I'm going to do is put a strip of Japanese tissue along here just to strengthen that inner end paper, and I'm going to put another one on the back because that had come away anyway. First of all, I'm going to put the guard onto the separated back end paper. So I'm just going to turn the book round and put some paste along the spine itself. It's a bit easier to do it that way, just like the guarding. If you saw that, it's much easier to do it like this and put the tissue paper onto the paste rather than the other way around. That's the one which I've folded ready. You can see I've got a slight fold in there, so I'm just going to lay it down on the, it's cut to size, so it should be fine. There's a bit of a lump of paste there, so I'll take that out. And that will then be there. You don't want to stick hinges into books when they've got their covers back on. If you do that, you find that you can't close the book properly, so all your repairs must be done from the centre outwards. Do all your paper repair first, then your guards, then you put the cover on and the new backing material around when you're ready and you've done everything on the inside. So that will just sit there. I'll have to let it dry before I can do anything else, but that will just sit there, and when we've finished we can close the cover down onto the end paper hinge. That will cover up the hinge nicely, and there'll be a back strengthener as well, so that will be fine. Now the other one, I'm just going to put, I think I'll just do the same thing. In fact, I shall put the paste onto this half of the board, and then I shall lay the tissue onto it and then paste the other part of it. It doesn't really matter how you do this, but I find that with Japanese tissue it's so flimsy and difficult to use if you're holding it in mid-air and it's pasted, that it's much easier to do it this way round. So that's down to there. And you can always add a bit more paste in if you think you need it. In fact, I think I'm going to leave that loose anyway, just as I did the back one, because then I can stick it down when all the messing about has happened, and it will just be there and ready to go down when required. So those two end paper hinges, which now look like that, are just going to sit there, and I'll let them dry before I do anything else. Here we are back with the Winnie the Pooh in the press. I've cleaned off the back, and all I've got to do now is put the new backing on, which will be some Faynot and a piece of an offcut of Angora paper. Grain's always got to be in the right direction, of course, which I shall use to put on, and then I shall prepare the boards. So this is fairly straightforward. It's just going to be an ordinary rebacking. You notice I'm using these paintbrushes for gluing. I find that for small things they work just as well. They're just flat ordinary paintbrushes from the Works artists' paintbrushes, and they're good for the stippling in that you need to do. This is not a very peculiar to restoration, but it is part of it. I don't usually, with books like this, straight flatten them out and re-round them. You can, but I think it's a bit invasive, and I tend to follow the shape that it's got to and sort of leave it as it is. Any bits of thread, just spread them down the spine. So just a piece of Faynot on the top, make sure it's level, and work it down, and then a bit more glue on the back. You don't need too much because you've got a fair amount of glue. This is just ordinary backing, it's nothing terribly special about it. And I'll just put this bit of backing on and give it a good rub down. And then while that's drying, I shall prepare the boards for reinsertion and show you a bit about how to reattach them. So I'll put this to one side, and here are the boards for the book. And I think what one is supposed to do is to cut away part of the cloth, and I will do it on another book, but I don't really want to do it on this because I don't want to interfere with the illustration which is there. So I think I'm going to leave the cloth at the edge here. But what I do need to do is with a sharp knife, and what I like is the hacksaw blade that's shaped, and I'll bring it up a bit, which is on a bevel, just like a leather paring knife but in miniature. Very easy to make from a hacksaw blade, cut in half, broken in half rather, and shaped on a grindstone. So I'm just going to make sure that you can see. Okay, I'll come up. That's right. I'm going to start here, and with the knife, which is sharp and stays sharp because of the metal it is, I'm lifting up the cloth, and I'll just bring it up so you can see. I'm lifting up the cloth so that it's coming away from the board, and I'm just cutting down along the cloth so that it comes away from the board, and I'll be able to put the new cloth over it. And rather like the end paper, I really want to take away a certain amount of the board to support the cloth, so that as you take the cloth away, a thin layer of board is resting on the cloth on this side. So you've got the gap for the mull, or whatever it is, Faynot, round the end paper this side, and the cloth is being lifted up here. Ideally the Faynot goes into the board and it's split, but it's so small you can't really do that, so we'll just have the material either side of the board. So carefully I'm going to ease along. You can use the palette knife for this. Usually they come up fairly easily. I'm angling the knife a little bit into the board so that it doesn't go very easy for the knife to go straight through. So I'm cutting down slightly into the board, and that I think will come to the end, and then I can just go around the corner so that the cloth the whole way along is lifted away from the board, and that will receive the new material. I will not do the strip down the side with the fold over, which I'm going to do later on, but in this case, because I'm leaving the cloth going right up to the edge of the board, I'm going to cut down into the board with this knife all the way down and then scrape away a bit of the width of the board, the thickness of the board, so that when you put the new cloth in, it doesn't make too much of a step down. It's straw board, it's old-fashioned straw board, which is alkaline, not acid, not used anymore, but very common material for this sort of ordinary book of the 1950s and thereabouts. I'm also going to get a bit of sandpaper and just go down the board and just smooth it off so that I've got the fold of the sandpaper. Fold it so you can see what I'm doing. Got the fold of the sandpaper inside the board, and that will smooth off any lumps. And then when you've done that, you can run your finger along and feel and see if there are any bits. I think it seems more or less all right. There's a little bit of a raised bit there. One thing about this, it never had any tapes, so there were no sort of bumps already, so that's fairly clear. So there we have the board there, and I'm going to do the same thing to the back one. I won't show you, it's going to be exactly the same. When I come to do the reattaching of the boards, I have an option. At the back, I could, if I wished, lift up the mull under the end paper and put the fray knot inside, but because I've got the tissue hinge here, it's much easier just to do the just to leave the board and have the fray knot underneath the Japanese tissue, which will be an extra strength on the inside, and that's absolutely fine. The cloth will be coming round the outside. The front one I have, however, because the end paper is attached, and I have stuck down the Japanese tissue hinge now, that I've lifted up so that we'll be able to get the new mull and the fray knot inside the end paper, and the cloth will go on the other side of the board. So you're going to have the material going each side of the board, and that will be reasonably strong. We're supposed to split these boards, but they're so narrow, so thin that you can't. It's much too complicated. So I'm going to start off by positioning the front board where I want it to be, and I need to look at the back to make sure that I get it in the right place, and that looks okay. Just move it down there. So you just check the squares all the way around and make sure that it's going back to where it should be. As very often happens, it's sagged a little bit, it's a little bit wider at the top there than it is at the bottom, but I'm not going to worry too much about that. It's certainly where it was, so that's fine. So there we are. I'm making sure I don't lose hold of it. That's where it wants to be. And now again, I can either put this in dry and add the glue, or add the glue first. I think I'm going to put it in dry as it's in place. So I'm easing the fray knot underneath the board, not on top of it as it's going there. And it should slip in reasonably easily. So, and sometimes at the very end it may be a help just to cut off the corner so it goes in a little bit more easily. So you can see there that it's going down inside the board under the end paper, and I'm just going to check the positioning again. It's slipped forward a little bit, so I'll just push the book back a bit. And now just replace the fray knot, and now I'm going to put some glue underneath that board so that I'll just turn it around a little bit. You don't want too much, Spread it out as much as you can. All it's got to do is hold. It doesn't need to be. It doesn't need to be too. Well, it doesn't want to be excessive, or you'll find it all squirts out in the wrong place. But that's firmly in place now for the end paper there. Underneath the end paper, I should say, for the frame. Not just check the position again. Push it back a little if it needs it. Looks fine. So now I'm going to turn it round, just check again and make sure that it's well inside. That's fine. And now I'll turn it round and do the same thing on the back. All I'm going to do here is to attach the fray knot to the board like that, and I'll put the end paper hinge down later. You don't really want to put it on now because there's going to be a certain amount of shifting with the new cloth. So what I'm going to do is put a bit of release paper underneath it, which I'll leave in, and just put a little bit of glue along the fray knot. And all I'm going to do is position the board on top of it, and then it will just be in place and ready to accept the new cloth. So I'm putting it down there, and then I'm going to turn over and check that it's positioned properly. Yeah, that's absolutely fine. So that's all right. That can just sit there now, and the release paper is preventing the glue from sticking to the Japanese paper. So we'll just let that set for a little bit. That's all dry now, so I can start to put the backing on. I've got a bit of orange cloth which is a bit bright, and you've got the backing to deal with. You often find that the back and the front are actually, rather the spine and the front, are rather different colours. So I think I'm going to turn this round. I'm going to use the reverse side of that, which I think will be a better blend. I'm going to put on a spine strip of it's an offcut of decent paper. It's quite a thick cloth, so we don't actually need a very strong spine strip, and we've got the original spine as well, so it's only just enough to keep the cloth away from the spine. So I'm going to put the glue underneath the cover. And slide it in. It doesn't matter which side of this you use. I have actually sanded the outer cover off because it's a buckram and it's waterproof, so it won't stick very well otherwise. But I think that will look quite nice. So I'm going to turn it over, glue out the spine strip. You see that I quite often use a palette knife for gluing. It's really quite it really works quite well. I'm going to some extent I'm guessing where you put the spine strip, but you just need to leave a bit of a space either side and make sure it'll come over. It's perhaps slightly wide, but that's fine. So I've got to decide where I want to cut this off, which is going to be about, yeah, I've been able to lift it up quite a fair way, so it's going to come to about there. So I want to cut this off around about there. So just with a scalpel, getting it straight this time. I think that's okay. Go over quite nicely there. So turn it round, raise the cloth. Yes, I'll do it that way around so you can. I'm doing it slightly backwards, but you can see what I'm doing. And then slip the cloth underneath, and make sure it's not loose over the spine. Make sure that it's really well worked in. And I'm holding the book quite firmly at the same time. If you do, actually I think that's still a bit long, I'm going to trim a little bit more off it So I think it will fit better. You don't want loose bits around the spine. It's much better to have them tight and a little bit less cloth. You won't find that it makes any difference to the strength of the glued line. You'll find that as long as the cloth can get over onto the board by about 1/8 of an inch, a couple of millimetres, that will hold it perfectly adequately. It's certainly not too short there. So I'm just going to firm that in. That's much better. That's tighter on there. You notice I'm not gluing the back. That's equivalent to making a case binding just the spine without the boards surrounding them separately. It is a case binding, and that's the repair we're doing. I'll go on to leather on another and different occasion. So we'll just let that set for a little bit, and then I'll do the turning in. So I've got the corners lifted up, and I'm just going to put a bit of glue on top of the turn-ins. Sometimes you find when you're doing these little slots for the cloth that the board is so thin that the cloth just comes away, and you can tuck it back down with no problem. Otherwise, you should be left with a little flap of the cloth across the top, which you can then put down on top of the new cloth. Sometimes you can put the book down flat and work on it like this. Sometimes you want to stand it up. It just depends on the book and how you're feeling, really. But that I think is going to look quite nice. That's level there, I think. And I'll just turn it round and do the other end. Make sure those are lifted adequately. Stand it up this time. If you have separate boards, you can make them up as a case and simply glue them back down as a case binding. That's perfectly all right. But there's pros and cons both ways. If you attach the boards first, you know they're exactly where you want them to be. If you stick it on as a case binding, you can't be absolutely sure you're in the right place. So that's, I think, nicely together. And I'm just going to make sure that one there is a little bit proud. That's better. So I think that's all right, and yeah, I'm quite happy with that. So I think I'm going to go ahead and glue these back down straight away. So there's a bit of adhesive there, and under this end as well. It's always as well, I didn't do it in the other one, but I did in fact when I left them pressing, to put a bit of release paper down inside so that those bits of glue don't stick to the end paper. So I'll just do the same thing here. Just trying to get it round so you can see what I'm doing. You notice that I still haven't put down the end paper hinge. I'm going to do that at the very last minute. I don't want to do it before then. And I'll just find another bit of release paper. Just to go under that. And I'm now going to stick down the cover itself, so I could just trim off some of those whiskers. And I'll just put a bit of glue underneath a whole lot. off a bit of those extra bits. I'll give it a rub down through some clean paper. You don't want to rub too hard onto old material, but that's reasonably tidy. And then I'll do the same thing on the front. Piece of paper. So there we are, and the only other thing to do is to stick the title on, which I shall do at the end, because we've still got the end paper, so I'm going to let all that dry and then come back and just finish it off. So what we've got to do now is to replace the back on here, which again could be coloured in. I don't think I'm going to bother, but it could. And also do the inside. So the front, the end paper is in one piece because I put the tissue down already, and I've just got to put a bit of glue down the inside, which I'll do now. Find a small brush. Going to put a bit of adhesive down here. There's quite a lot of joint to it, so I'm going to make sure that it is actually well down into the joint. So rather than just putting it down like that, I'm going to make sure it's well rubbed down. You can see there is quite a joint there, and make sure that the board goes down and holds it well back. If you put it down and it's too tight, the whole of the first section will come up with the end paper, but I think that should be fine. And then the other side, there's just this little bit here. With a leather joint, this joint is always very big and you have to do it open. In this case, I think I can quite simply just close it, and it should be quite all right. I'll just put a bit of adhesive on here. Could be paste, but I've got PVA out now, so I think I'm going to use that. It's quicker. And I'm going to also leave a bit of release paper in, because the adhesive does go through the Japanese tissue very easily. So that's all done. There's the release paper, and I'll just close it down on top of it. That'll be fine. And the only other thing to do now is to replace the title. And there's quite a lot of board support on here, which I think I'm going to take off, because if you have quite a strong back, which this is, it's got an extra bit of backing inside, and it's a strong cloth anyway. I don't think you need that extra support of the for the cloth. I think I'll just show you what I'm doing. I'll finish it off away from the camera, because it's like watching paint dry, I think. Oh no, it's coming away quite easily, I think. Yeah, that's okay. Sometimes if you've got a really fragile back, you can't do this sort of thing. You would have to take it off extremely carefully. This is just lifted off easily, and you would need possibly even to support it on a bit of Japanese tissue sometimes. If you've got a really fragile leather spine, that's what you sometimes have to do. I think that'll be fine. Just going to trim off the whiskery bits on the end. And I'll just paste it out. I should have a bigger brush really, make it rather easier, but it'll be okay. It's fairly absorbent because there's still quite a bit of board on it, but nothing to make lumps, I don't think. So just make sure that it's well centred and that it looks in the right place. You can, if you wish, put the book in a press to do this, and then you can make absolutely sure that it's centred. I'm going to put a bit of paper around it, release paper again, and just give it a bit of a rub down through the paper so that I don't actually damage it. If necessary, you can tie the whole book up with a bandage. In fact, I think I'll do that just as a demonstration for you. You have a piece of release paper round the back, and just wrap the bandage round so that you've got, this is an elastic bandage so that it pulls the title strip, spine strip, down onto the book and holds it firmly. So if we just leave that, that's well pulled down onto the spine, and that will then be ready. And there's the cover back on, the spine rather, and the join, which is really quite reasonable, and the inside is now quite firm. That looks fine, I think, and that's now tipped back down, so it's all pretty much as it was. Not a valuable book, but just one that's quite nice to have in one piece.